You're listening to the Contemplative Light podcast with your host, Clint Sabom.
Hey, and welcome to the Contemplative Light podcast. I'm your host, Clint Sabom. Contemplative Light is a community of inner spiritual writers and teachers providing resources for the healing of persons. Contemplative Light, silence, practice, healing. And we've got a lot of good things going on in 2019. Mark Shaw has a book out, Dante's Road, and you can get that on our website at contemplativelight.com. You can also find it on Amazon. And we also have online classes available in spirituality and growth, and you can check those out as well on our website at contemplativelight.com. Hey, Mark. Okay, cool. We are on. How are you doing, man?
Doing well, Clint. Just kind of excited to dive into some of the stuff today. I'm kind of interested into where it leads.
Yeah, me too. I'm totally interested in talking about it as well. The Family, the documentary, it does seem to be getting popular on Netflix. I guess it's probably almost been a week. I mean, it really just kind of came out, and different people are reacting in different ways. I've heard people that are definitely kind of pissed off or disillusioned or maybe even disturbed. Before we get into what our take is, what are you hearing from other people?
So, not a whole lot, surprisingly. Kind of when it came out, there's that initial spike in interest, and the other documentary that comes to mind that you might have a sort of comparison and contrast with is another Netflix documentary of Wild Country and the sort of Oregon compound in the 80s of sannyasins from India. And
You mean Wild Wild West?
no, it's a different one called Wild Country. It might be Wild Country, I think. Is it?
You mean Osho? The one about Osho?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, The Family did not make me think about Osho's compound.
You're right. It's Wild Country, somewhere between both of ours. So,
okay.
It just in terms of the expose, in the format of the documentary and the deep dive into this kind of secretive community with a religious foundation, and I guess one of the reasons I suppose there's a significant contrast is there's kind of no smoking gun per se with the Family. There is plausible deniability. The figures of the Family, you can kind of still see your sort of shucks, young life, sort of youth pastor or friend from college or high school or whatever, and their kind of pure motives having impure effects without a singular, earth-shattering scandal that bespeaks intentional corruption. Whereas in Wild Country, there was, attempted murder, and there was the poisoning in public restaurants, and there were some sort of seedier, juicier, in a sense, if you're looking for sort of impure motives and sort of more clear-cut evil, so to speak.
Well, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I guess the Family, they're just kind of going around, they're putting themselves in a position of power, they're ministering to those in power, even if those in power are dark and corrupt and even doing toxic things to the people they lead. The Family's there to minister to them. The Family's there to meet with them, to mention the word Jesus, and Jesus plus nothing. I mean, it's just kind of like, hey guys, let's fly over to Nazi Germany and just go see Hitler, and just make sure when we talk to him we get in the word Jesus, get that word in quick, and I liked what the UCC, I think it was a UCC minister that was talking at one point, and he was saying they use them kind of as a talisman or as a mascot. It's just kind of like they're taking Jesus, like he's just this kind of magic item, and they're just kind of placing him here. It's almost like you've got these seeds, or I mean, maybe they're not seeds because maybe it's BS. Nothing grows from it. It's just an object, and you've got all these different objects, and you're just going around and placing the objects in strategic locations. And the object is just the word Jesus. It's just like you've got a bunch of pebbles in a little sack, and you're going around meeting with all the powerful people, and you're saying, hey, here's a pebble, here's a pebble, here's another pebble. It's a kind of almost, kind of similar to what like voodoo and people like that do. So I mean, there's obviously like dark implications, and obviously like there's just the whole idea of ministering to the wolves. I mean, I mean, when you're saying it's pure motive, I think you could probably question that there. Like just cut it off at the beginning. Like, is Jesus for the sheep or is Jesus for the wolf? And they were talking about how most Christians think Jesus is for the sheep, but why couldn't he be for the wolf too? Jesus is for the sheep. Like, stop. Like, no, like right there. No, don't rationalize it. You just want to get in with the power people. Like, come on. Like that's just like trying to rationalize, like getting in with the power people, like ministering to the wolves.
It
no.
gets into.
I mean, that's where I might draw the line.
What we talk about a lot in contemplative light, which is the mental or even sort of spiritual infrastructure and those assumptions that we that frame our psychological, spiritual, contemplative lives and what we're oriented toward and why and the meaning that we do ascribe to that talisman of the name Jesus. And all of that is implicit. It's sort of beneath the surface. And some of the work, let's say, of a liberal arts education is to start to inspect that and deconstruct and examine the structure, the mental infrastructures that we have, that we've been conditioned by, why we think that way, and then assess, might there be a better way to reconstruct and get reoriented? Is a lot of even what we're about through our contemplative practices that just sort of naturally occurs as a function of that. Paired with study can be that much more powerful to kind of have some language and terminology to go along with it. But I think that from a, let's say, more conservative, traditional, evangelical perspective, it's always both and. Well, Jesus may be for the sheep, but what is the most effective way? And then those metaphors of sheep and wolf are maybe not applicable in their mind. You've got maybe people in power who are maybe more prone to corruption and ambition and greed, and that's how they got there. Well, there's such emphasis in that culture on leadership, and authority is an implied word that kept coming up. Anytime I heard it, it just kind of jumped out at me. And certainly, I'm imagining as I'm watching it, my conservative Pentecostal parents and their reactions to the different interviews, the different things that are posited, and what the implied subset of beliefs are that they're bringing to the table as they're watching it, who they're rooting for, what they identify as important, and what they identify.
Yeah, would they see the documentary as exposing the family unjustly, or would they see it as, oh, that was an accurate portrayal of people doing good work, albeit the documentarians were a little maybe liberal in their bias?
Yes, I think more so exactly that, except they would say, well, their reductionistic gospel is a problem. Their intentional desire to rub shoulders with power is always going to, they're more of sort of isolationist, separatist in their approach to spirituality than directly engaging with political maneuvering and motivation in mind. But they would not. I don't think that they would necessarily judge it as inherently wrong, and they would find so much commonality in the tone, the language, the sort of style and background of a lot of the family members. They would see much of themselves and their community reflected in that sort of white guy, small town Christian values, purity, morality. Let's have more of that. So the family is advancing their ideological agenda, however much they are aware or not aware of specifically what that is. And there's a lot of fuzziness of thinking surrounding that, just like there's fuzziness of thinking in the family to specify what is it we're after exactly. And let's not get, Jesus plus nothing. Let's just keep it simple. And if that has some negative side effects, well, that's a pittance compared to the worldwide impact that you've had.
And so, and so this in this line of thinking would probably just say, well, none of these other Christians or evangelicals or people from our church really want to go to Washington and deal with these people. So at least
exactly, and if anything, I think it would be an encouragement because of the assumption on a broad part of evangelicals that Washington, in terms of power, and Hollywood, in terms of a different kind of power, are these playgrounds of Satan, or it's selfish, it's egotistical, it's greed, it's quote the world.
Dude, you know what I just thought of? How about we be the family for Hollywood?
Oh, I already know those people.
They're already there. Oh man,
email address.
But maybe there's a niche for like the progressive family in Hollywood. I mean, come on, most of them are liberal.
You'll have to look up Barbara Nicolosi. And
Barbara Nicolosi
is one, and there's another who's Ron. Man, his name is escaping me right now, but these are people of faith who have a long time involvement in Hollywood as screenwriters, producers, screenwriting teachers, and they have kind of bridged the Christian community to Hollywood. In fact, the director of Doctor Strange, Scott Derrickson, is sort of a product of that same system. And if you look at some of his interviews, he's sort of subtly introduces there's got to be something more than this reality, and Doctor Strange brings a spiritual component to the Marvel universe, even though, certainly when I was growing up, Doctor Strange would have been confiscated as New Age hocus pocus.
Huh. So, but these people sound like less of a ministry and more like they're carving out a niche in the film world for Christians to kind of enter into.
Yeah, I mean that would be a more subtle distinction, and that in a way is its own kind of ministry. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and I guess people could like kind of get into politics through making inroads with the family. Yeah, I mean I guess the family did kind of work like that.
I get what you're saying in terms of they are in the background, but a lot of the C Street, this place, for those that haven't seen that part, maybe the documentary, is like a living quarters, a house in Washington where certain members of Congress will stay while they're in Washington, and they have regular prayer groups and such. And I think there's an interesting dynamic of what prayer is and its function in individual and community life that is assumed in evangelical circles to imbue purity, imbue righteousness, imbue, if you kind of want to win an argument, you throw in, well, I prayed about this in evangelical circles. And so even that language throughout of, well, we meet for prayer breakfast and we're organizing prayer breakfasts in other countries, that is its own justifying act and will purify motive. And if you pair that with the sort of conservative ideology of purity, of purifying the family, of purifying the country, and in some cases there's a sort of humane way to go about that, and then in certain instances in the documentary, like in Uganda, where there was murders of gay people, then they have that are criticized for having the deniability of withdrawing. Well, we didn't write that bill. But how that plays out is its own sort of separate discussion. But prayer as the means to connect with a God of purity, to usher in that sort of purity and righteous authority on earth is.
Yeah, I missed that part about Uganda. Like I couldn't tell whether the family really endorsed it or it was just a byproduct, or something that the family kind of, not even colluded with, but basically, let's say, prayed with leaders from Uganda, and Uganda leaders ended up doing that. But did the family ever really endorse what they ended up doing with killing the gay people? Could you tell?
And this is an interesting dynamic. So when they were writing the bill, Doug Coe stepped in to the individual in the family who was the liaison to Africa and advised him against certain language in there, or to tone it down, or whatever it was, kind of a muted form to not have a violent outcome. And that was because of the capital offense.
Okay.
There was a line in the bill that made being homosexual a capital offense, and the kind of leadership of the family wanted that removed.
Well, that's the right thing to do.
Right, well, at least. But then he said,
at least, right.
with other delegates from Africa, there was a shocking kind of casualness with which it was discussed. Like the final solution of the Jews in the Third Reich. There's a casualness, like it's the other. We don't identify with it. It's an abstract category, not a human being we're talking about.
Is this the family's thinking or Uganda's thinking?
Uganda. And so the representative, the liaison, a member of the family, was saying, hey, aren't these God's children too? And he's trying to wrestle with the moral conundrum of how to relate to Ugandan homosexuals. But that cross-cultural gap, the cultural gap, meant that if we export this value, how that's received and then actually lived out has destructive, violent, tragic consequences. And there's another kind of layer of how America relates to the world. We want to export these values, but we have a certain subset of unconscious other values from years of whatever, democracy, or a kind of framework within which even a disagreement also has its own, dignified engagement. But another element that I think is, like you mentioned at the beginning, hey, let's go minister Jesus to Hitler at the start, is this idea of implied authoritarianism, and why Trump is so appealing to in different ways. That was an eye-opener as well. When I speak with people like my mom, who's in so many ways a loving, generous, big-hearted person, the ideology that they've extracted from the years of kind of a conservative theology is authority. Righteous, pure authority is a kind of.
All right, but what's the authority rooted in? That's what's so confusing. Can't everybody be their own personal authority?
No, so and that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that inevitably there, and the chosenness, of this kind of red level consciousness, Old Testament type thinking that God chooses out righteous leaders, and that another component is humble submission for most of us is appalling. And we need to submit to righteous authority. And that authority is going to be basically male. It's gendered, it's masculine. And it is going to, have a certain charisma about it by kind of default. And you find this automatically at work in a lot of churches. And so you're just taking the kind of cultural political system that you're familiar with that is the foundation of it is the gospel, or at least if not the gospel, then the Bible, and you can pick out a thread, an element, a layer of the Bible that can support that type of thinking, and then that becomes exportable. When what you're trying to do is find a righteous leader equals a righteous nation, because they will not only introduce but enforce laws that protect that purity and righteousness for the collective. And so there is an inevitable kind of loss of. This is something that I had to kind of come to grips with. It wasn't even until college, until you look at what the authors of the Constitution came out of and were trying to correct against, which was authoritarianism. And they were trying to put these based on the age of reason and rationalism, uh, established, harkening back to the Greeks and whatever else, put a system in place of that was bottom up instead of top down. And that is a radical shift in thinking from this authoritarianism that so many in America think is still adopt as their primary ideology. It's like democracy is a structure and kind of a neutral one. And the key is to get a godly, righteous, authoritarian figure in that. And if people don't want to submit to that, then they have some spiritual work to do. They don't want to submit to God either, probably. They're rebellious by nature.
They're imposing amber like on top of like an orange playing field,
Right.
meaning like with integral talk. I mean, you basically have the founding fathers starting this country very much from an Enlightenment rationalist, kind of orange perspective, modern perspective, whatever words you want to use, moving away from the kind of more medieval authoritarianism, ethnocentric. But then somehow with Christianity, well, you still have both of those in Christianity, but with the group we're talking about here, with the conservative evangelicals, so much has gone into that kind of amber. And when I say that, I'm referring to like integral theory. It's parallels with spiral dynamics as well. Same concept of kind of structures of growth and history and in the individual, but basically it's a step down from the founding fathers. It's a regression.
And interestingly enough, that is kind of the cross pollination, is that level of consciousness you're talking about with those, Thomas Keating's three ego centers. And this is fundamentally that safety and security ego center paired with that level of consciousness that is seeking out the power and control ego center people to bring about their project, which is safety, security, um, and strong boundaries of the moral life and the communal life, of the national life, of clear cut sort of right and wrong, and black and white thinking, and dualism sort of par excellence. And the family is essentially at the amber level, safety and security people trying to impact, power, and control people to bring about the world that they envision.
Now, do you think in some of these evangelical circles, whether it's the leaders or whether it's people kind of very devoted to it, or people in the family that are kind of real good at talking this Christianese, but obviously a lot of people in that demographic have these little backslides where they'll get like prostitutes and hookers and cheat on their wives and do some really crazy stuff in the midst of having kind of values against it. Do you think they're ever conscious of a split, like they'll be like in church, or one of those that Sanford guy from South Carolina getting up there at the press conference talking a little bit of Christianese? It's like, do you ever think they're like, wow, I'm really killing it with this Christianese, and then it's like they're off the podium and they're like, wow, now time to go to the strip bar after church with some brewskis? I mean, do you think there's ever like a conscious awareness, or do you think it's like they really believe they've gotten back on
I
track,
think
but then
there
they slip
is an
again or
inner
something
dualism that's
unconsciously?
brought about by a kind of holiness, righteousness, or purity theology that you have to kind of, it becomes performative, and you have to inhabit the role as much as you can. And if you don't, well, that's, the shadow side, you also don't really have to take ownership of. It's like Satan coming after you. So you can kind of renounce that if it does come to light, and your fallen nature, and King David and Bathsheba, and there's, God's chosen one, and he brought him about. They touch on that in the documentary as well. That's kind of one of the early kind of shocking realizations this kid has that goes in there and later becomes a journalist and writes about it. Is this the kind of moral contortionism of, if you're chosen, then you have a different set. You're a spiritual elite that operates by a different set of rules. So your chosenness confers righteousness, which relativizes moral behavior. And so that's one layer of it. Another layer is, if your focus is constantly is not on the infrastructure you've built up of, I need the world to be safe, secure, stable, moral, and all the implications of that is all your projects that you're trying to bring about in the world. And so it brings to mind Oedipus Rex. In some literary criticism work, I recall that the author said, one of the things that got me started on literature is, early on, a high school lit teacher told me to look for the image of eyes and sight in Oedipus Rex, and it was on almost every page. And the idea being that there is an inverse relationship between power and self-awareness. That, in a sense, to put your focus and purely think about impacting the world and all the tasks and agenda items and meetings and all that has to go on to be a quote leader in that space, it will, by almost naturally, but definition, just the way things are, reduce your capacity for self-awareness. And so, from a conservative perspective, like these people, these men are doing their best to address that shortcoming by engaging in regular prayer, Christian fellowship, and so on. So they are.
Oh, do they even see it as a shortcoming, though?
Oh, I mean, there were examples of men in the, unfaithful husbands in political positions in the documentary. I think they would certainly see those as shortcomings.
That's, I mean, would they recognize it as self-awareness? That wasn't a phrase I heard them use.
No, but it was, I think, assumed to be a channel for, realignment in prayer, fellowship, and so on. Accountability.
Sure. I got you. That's interesting, because I mean, I wonder, like, what you were saying about Oedipus Rex, I wonder how true that is now. Like, because I think it is both true and untrue. I think we have both. I think we have people in power without a whole lot of self-awareness, and we have business leaders and heads of corporation without a lot of self-awareness, and we probably have people at the top that do have a large degree of self-awareness. I mean, one example I feel would be Barack Obama. I mean, whether you think he was a good president or not, I always had the sense he had a sense of self-awareness. I always had the sense that even just kind of looking at him talk or seeing him at times, I was like, oh, this guy's aware of the inner world. He's aware of the flow a little bit in a way that a lot of leaders aren't. But I mean, I don't know. What do you think as far as the inverse or correlative relationship between self-awareness and power in the world 2019?
I think that is an astute observation, and it highlights the need for consistently sort of revising our axioms and staying in that beginner's mind and taking the world as it is and being able to recognize when there is, uh, uh, you know, self-awareness in power or graciousness in power or uncorrupt, people trying to do their best in high positions. And what you can fall into, certainly on an extreme leftist bent, is, playing the following game. I am self-aware. People in power are not self-aware. Therefore, I disidentify, and that those become inevitably greedy, corrupt, power-hungry people that I make it my mission in life to fight against, and it becomes
Sure, and Ken Wilber would call that a power allergy. He traces it back to red. When you have that kind of early childhood development, when you have issues of power. I think Erickson's stage was age 3 to 6, and psychoanalytic theory, age 3 to 6 was an issue of, I think it was initiative versus guilt, and before that was autonomy versus self-doubt. It kind of plays into that stuff as far as whether you become a power addict or you become power allergic. And I think a lot of people on the left are the green postmodern kind of vibe. And, you might see a lot in Berkeley or whatnot that can tend towards a power allergy maybe, whereas someone like Trump would be a power addict. But I don't think. But back to what you're saying about the trap of the left. Overall, I think there's a lot of neoliberals in this country that are not self-aware. Basically, I think there's a whole group on the left that kind of jumps on the left because it just seems like the more balanced, intelligent, compassionate side. But they might not have done, a whole lot of inner work or have much of a self-awareness to them. I see that trend as well.
I think that's right, and I think some on the self-awareness side, um, connecting to this idea of prayer and the different kinds of prayer. More recently, was talking to someone about the three types of prayer encoded in Vatican II by the Catholic Church: is discursive or verbal prayer. That's one kind. Imaginative prayer, like the Ignatian spirituality, and then contemplative prayer, silent prayer. And to kind of to me, those are almost concentric. And the heart of prayer is that contemplative prayer, precisely because what is unearthed is the hidden motivation, the egocentrism. You start to become more and more aware of those aspects of the psyche that are uh, egotistic and need to be excavated, examined, let go of on that level, which is in the inmost self. Whereas a lot of the discourse of prayer on that external layer is precisely that. It's on the surface. It's unexamined. It's sort of untransformed, sometimes unredeemed, even with invoking the name of God, invoking the name of Jesus, but without the kind of having done the inner work that would genuinely purify that, not just by implication, by calling it prayer and using the right language. And so I think that ties in directly with kind of what what we try to equip people with is those, that the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, which transcends any of the kind of immediate goal-oriented kind of prayer.
Sure. I mean, it's like, and what it comes down to basically is, we've kind of gone this far, and interestingly enough, we haven't totally bashed the family, but it would be worth like me mentioning like my main takeaway, which is we're not really even in the realm until you just kind of said that. We haven't really been in the realm of the whole contemplative or mystic side of spirituality, because I think it's like the two main themes of the family are basically power and Jesus. And I'd say, if you say, if you ask the question about power, like where is power located, and then you ask the question about Jesus, where is Jesus located? And I think for the contemplative, you're going to find both of those in the world within. You're going to find both of those in the presence, in the state of being that is beyond the goal-oriented stuff, as you say, beyond the world of form and time and space, even that kind of um, pure contemplation or something close to it, whether you want to just think of it as practicing the presence of God. I mean, that's what it's all about. Whereas I think the family, they would locate power in the world leaders. I mean, that's where worldly power is, and spiritual power is in Jesus. But, if you ask them where is Jesus located, they would probably just give some generic bland answer like, well, Jesus is everywhere. What are you talking about? Or, Jesus is wherever you say his name. Or so it's kind of like where's the treasure chest located? And the family is very much about basically getting to the treasure chest of the world and injecting it with Jesus. And we're basically saying, look, it's here now, wherever you're sitting or standing or driving at this moment. And the point of our forms of prayer and meditations are to kind of get you there. So, the true power is just within and being at peace within. And because I think when you have that, you don't, who cares about worldly power and the quest of all of that to some degree? I mean, who cares enough to um, really do anything about it or even think about it? I mean, it sounds almost kind of apathetic, but it's really just like um, I don't know, your whole orientation towards everything. I mean, they're really kind of making an altar out of worldly power in a sense.
Mm. I think that's precisely sort of at the heart of the discussion is what are your assumptions about what power is, and the answer to that question kind of determines ideological difference, theological difference, and so the for many, Jesus is the coming King, and so we are kind of preparing the way to make the world a righteous enough place to be receptive to the pure God in human form who's going to return. And so our work is to kind of make the world a hospitable place for that kind of purity in a moral sense, and or suffer the judgment of not getting that done. And so the power of prayer and the power that we associate with Jesus is precisely the power to bring about moral um, conversion and moral transformation in the world. And that is one definition of power. And the other, which carries in it that implicit authority, an external authority, which is in either Jesus or God, however you kind of frame it in a conservative perspective. And The other kind of power that I think we associate with Jesus is one of a more explosive one of dissolving and dismantling the ego altogether, which is just a totally different game.
And I think sometimes it's something that just has to happen to people, and then if it doesn't happen, they're not really quite aware it's even possible until it does happen to them. But it's interesting because it's like, as I'm saying this, and I'm basically saying, okay, well, I mean, now as I'm saying, it's all about the contemplative space and being and presence. It's almost like I hear this chorus of pissed off liberals in the background being like, well, that's the worst thing contemplatives can do. We need to take action in the world. It's not just about sitting around. And I mean, two things on that, or three things on that. The Dalai Lama did say that it's not that internal transformation is the best way to bring about world peace. It's the only way. So, I mean, and that basically sums it up for me. Number two, we're on a podcast. We're putting stuff out in the world, like we are doing something about it. But we were talking about self-consciousness before the podcast. Now I'm getting self-conscious of like what I'm imagining listeners criticizing about this.
But I think even the most activist people, would have the experience to know that motivation matters, and the awareness of within which your activism is rooted is huge.
Sure, yeah, because activism can go wrong too. I mean, it can backfire, and sometimes I think there are kind of a lot of intangible qualities that we may not even see or even be able to understand that have to do with the kind of energy you're taking into something. But I mean, at the same time, I kind of sympathize with that, because you look at something like the family, and even if you can't necessarily talk about it well, even if you can't like pinpoint them on, 5 smoking guns, as you say, I look at something like that and I'm just like, that's just not a good thing. That needs to be stopped. Like, stop it immediately, please. Like, I mean, how do you stop that? I don't know. I'm glad this dude was able to do a documentary and expose it. And it sounded like the family almost saw it coming, though. Like, they knew the internet age was here. I mean, they're not going to hide forever. I mean, Doug Coe's not going to have his little Christian mafia, invisibility game running. But with the internet, it's just kind of not possible in the same kind of way. So they're kind of prepared to talk about it. But yeah, I mean, the other bottom line, other than what I mentioned about like where is Jesus and power located, I think the other bottom line is, I just think it's a real sick thing. I mean, it's just disgusting. It needs to be stopped. I mean, that's just how it hit me, like just on a raw level. I mean,
there's so many responses I have to it. My dad is a Christian missionary to Europe, and is currently lives in Vienna and is having more and more inroads to kind of some local, like, Catholic leaders. It's a Catholic country, sort of official state religion, and the local cardinal. He's having more, and he'll kind of give me updates. Oh, I had lunch again with this assistant to the cardinal, and we're having a real impact on the country for Jesus. So I just hear a lot of parallel between some of the stuff reported about Doug Coe being like, I prayed for this, and then this door opened, and then I spoke with that world leader, and the power of prayer is evident in the impact that he had on his life, and the kind of enthusiasm and that I get from my own family on what they are, the family are involved in, and what they're trying to bring about, which is targeting countries that my dad used to have. I used to work as an assistant for him in his office, and he would have like country breakdowns of some of those same countries they talk about in the show of Albania and Romania, and a kind of profile of the country, it's a bit of its history, its values, who, what, where, to be able to pray over the country in a kind of general way.
It's
Or
ambitious and evangelism. It's just
yeah,
that's what it is. Yeah.
exactly. So to see from their perspective, to see people being that effective of having contacts in the country and getting, wow, God's doing some amazing things. And the opportunity for ministering and conversion and building church communities out of national prayer breakfasts. Who knew? They always assume there are these kind of commando groups coming in under cover of night and starting these clandestine communities that will hopefully grow and take over, grassroots, bottom up, the nation at some point. But the opposite end of starting from the top, well, that could be effective too.
Well, I think two things on that. I think that even without Jesus, I think talking to people in power or talking to people that are well connected has that kind of effect of opening doors. Whether whether you're mentioning Jesus or not. I mean, my experience has been that that kind of thing can happen. Just the way our kind of socioeconomic universe is set up. I mean, you talk to some people in power, you make a decent connection with them, and sometimes doors open. And I'm not even talking about huge power. I mean, talking about, I mean, to even something like talking to someone that I interview on the podcast, and some other door opens to somebody else. Something like that. And then we got sirens going off. I'm in downtown San Antonio looking out at a beautiful skyline with ambulances going off. The other thing I was going to mention is Jesus. I think Jesus works, kind of unilaterally, like equivocal. Man, that's a tough word to say, but I mean, he works no matter what, no matter who you are. So if you, I mean, I think that's, I mean, I guess you could call it blaspheming the Holy Spirit. I mean, if you really wanted to just, you really just wanted to pin the family, like, if like I got assigned to like the court of the high heavens, and they're like, St. Peter's like, Clint, where did they go wrong with the sin? I'd say, oh, that's a blaspheme of the Holy Spirit for sure, the way they use Jesus, because I mean, I think Jesus does work, if you just inject Jesus into a place, he's going to come and the presence is going to be there, no matter who it is, no matter where it is. And so I think that's why evangelism works, but there's no guarantee that just because there's a presence there that in some way there's going to be positive outcomes, if that makes sense, if you followed all that. Yeah.
I think, and also the ambulances somehow just a beat later managed to hit suburban San Diego. So
yeah, that was bizarre. I mean, it's like I don't know how I that's the heavens saying we're absolutely on point, right?
Affirmation. There's the Saint Anthony and Saint is it Jude are on our side.
Yes, something like that. Yeah, we're healers. I mean, what does the ambulance do? He takes people to the hospital. This is the Holy Hospital, contemplativelight.com. All are welcome.
What strikes me as an interesting counterpoint to the whole kit and caboodle is Andrew Harvey is this English mystic, teacher, author, who was in, I believe it's Oxford, and Oxford has a best of the best college called All Souls, and you're invited if you're among the top percentile in your college at Oxford to sit the exams for All Souls, and All Souls is like a free ticket. It's like a ticket to power, to privilege, to status, to uh, a seat at the table. You are provided, I think, with 2 or 3 years, or maybe as long as you want. I think it's tuition free, and everything's covered, housing, kind of open ended research projects, and the brightest and best of the best. And then he said it quickly occurred to me with hobnobbing with lunches with the powerful and the famous and the wealthy, the titans of industry and politics. and becoming the new social circle, that it was, most of them were sort of sociopaths. That was kind of his conclusion at the time. Mind you, this is many, many years ago, um, but he sets off for. He had spent part of his early life, I believe, in India, and kind of went back to just explore and get away and say, what I want my life to actually be about, and ended up at Bede Griffith's ashram, and sort of studied and under the tutelage of Bede Griffiths, after a couple twists and turns. But that path of of solitude, contemplation, almost the monastic path, so to speak, as a counterpoint to the whole project of the family, is an interesting one, and yet the pragmatic counter to that even is, what are you supposed to do? Disengage? Into escape into your monastery? There is such a thing as a society. There is such a thing as a political structure. There are these roles of leaders and leadership, and how is all that to be conducted? Should we just, let it all go to hell, or I'm kind of playing devil's advocate for a different approach, but kind of what's your thoughts on that? I mean, we're in this contemplative space, which tends toward the isolationist. It speaks to the introvert. There is a note of, you've been in a monastery. Um,
Yeah, sure. I mean, I see what you're pointing at. And real quick background: Andrew Harvey that the story's about, is a writer on Christian mysticism, and Bede Griffiths was a Catholic priest that kind of became a monk in the Hindu tradition, kind of fused Christianity and Hinduism and started a Christian ashram movement in India. Harvey's still alive. Bede Griffiths is dead, but. So, yeah, as far as the sociopaths in power, yeah, there's a kind of cluelessness. Now, they might not be the ruthless kind of sociopath, but in the sense that they may not have much of a capacity for self-reflection. They might not have much of the kind of conscience or overdeveloped superego that a lot of sensitive types have. There is kind of that. In a sense, I'm almost curious. Doug Coe's still alive. Doug Coe wants to meet with me. Absolutely, I would meet with him. I would see what would happen. Heck, I might even fake it. I'll just basically disgrace myself here at the end. Like, after everything I've said, would I meet with the leaders of the family? Absolutely. I might even just kind of play the game and see what happens. See what I can peek into. Maybe I'd do that. I don't know. I can't say, like, until you get in a situation like that, because you could be so repulsed you could just walk away. But I do think that I don't know. I do think that interfacing with it is important. But yeah, do you fight it, or do you try to befriend it, or do you I don't know, but I definitely resonate with what Harvey said, as far as there's something about him that's just checked out. But I wanted to ask you, I don't want to forget to ask you this, and sorry to change the topic, but you said you had a friend that was in the family. Do you feel comfortable mentioning anything like that, or at least anything he said?
so I think it was, and by the way, sort of the first episode or two just reminded me of, like, wholesome kids from Christian college, and trying to figure out what their life's all about, with the assumption of, I want it to be godly and righteous, and have an impact on the world, and but all at the same time kind of be obedient to the healthy authority that God has placed around me, and whatever the language there is of what those, the boys in the Ivanwald, this kind of communal house living space. It reminded me of the kind of good old boys from Christian colleges, and so here's one of them is a buddy of mine who went to Westmont, in Santa Barbara and was invited to be part of this regular prayer group. And on occasion would invite another friend of his to go there too. And so it was kind of as innocuous as that. It was like, boys at a Christian college invited by sort of, elders in their community to go to a prayer group. And so I don't know that it kind of stayed vague, just like it does in the movie. And none of them ever, none of the friends of mine ever kind of went so far as to move into a house and forsake their, worldly relationships to sacrifice everything for the family. But a lot of the similar ethos and language and vibe and style just reminded me so much of just like a Christian college dorm boys wing.
Yeah, I gotcha. But are you basically trying to say he wasn't in the family?
He participated in their groups. I don't know if what does it mean that
he lived at Ivanhoe or went to DC.
I think it's a little more nuanced than that too, in terms of nationwide little prayer groups that are part of it.
Yeah, they're just friends. They're friends of the family. There's no members.
Exactly. And so I don't know that that would have been maybe a feeder system into one of the more activist communities that were part of the family, but this is sort of an ancillary aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, playing basketball on the driveway kind of looked like fun. I miss those days in like suburbia playing basketball on the driveway. Do you have a basketball goal at your house?
I do.
You do? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But not in the driveway. It's in my backyard.
But do you have concrete back there under it, or grass?
Just
a little bit. Do you go out there and like shoot sometimes?
Yeah, when I need a little break. In fact, I just raised the goal from 7 feet to 10 feet yesterday because my son hadn't been using it much, and he's out and about.
Nice. Golly, that doesn't sound half bad. No wonder, that's the real contemplative practice.
Prayer of the body.
Jesus loves a good 3-point shooter. That's what they said in the documentary. I was a 3-point shooter in high school. I was great.
If his form is good, yeah.
Yeah, if his form is good. Got to have good, fundamentally sound. That's what fundamentalism first reminded me of, like fundamentals in basketball.
That's interesting because when when the discussion turns to sort of in any conversation of using the term fundamentalist in a negative way, it's accrued that negative connotation over time. And, my dad, having been a missionary to Europe, spent a good 20 years overseas. And so as the cultures, a certain language in the culture changes its nuanced meaning, he'll be like, what happened to the word fundamental? It used to just mean people who practice the fundamentals of the faith. How did it come to mean, have this secondary layer of bigot?
Yeah, because Falwell usurped the word. That's why. But I mean, the biggest argument against fundamentalism is if you look at the players, like if you just jump like metaphoric arenas into basketball, the biggest argument against fundamentalism is like, look at the players in the NBA. Are they there and really, all-stars because they're fundamentally sound? I don't think so. I think it's a lot of just raw athleticism. You know what I mean? So maybe that's the same way with like religion, and spirituality. Yeah, you've got to get off the podcast. Okay. Wish we could talk forever, but all right, cool.